Yes, and they're quite similar. I think the main difference would be just in the scope, because here in Cambridge, most research masters tend to be 1 year MPhil courses
Yep.
between 9 months and 12 months. So you're expected to do research and write a dissertation in that period of time. So I think both the length and the scope of the work is going to be somewhat shorter than what's expected of a PhD, which is between 3 and 4 years. So I would say it's good preparation for a PhD in certain fields, and in many fields it's not required. You could transition from a taught master's to a PhD, but if you're interested in a shorter term research project and you're not sure whether a PhD is the right fit for you, this can be a good sort of starting point.
Hello everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We're here with a new guest today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ramji Venkataramanan. I'm a professor of information engineering at the Department of Engineering, and also a fellow at Trinity Hall and director of studies, and also a postgraduate tutor at Trinity Hall. And that's a capacity in which I'm here.
Nice, great. And we're here to talk about the postgraduate application process. We're going to go through what the process is like, frequently asked questions that applicants have about the process. So Ramji, if a student is thinking about applying for a postgraduate course, when should they be starting to think about starting the application?
Yeah, so earlier the better, I would say. So to be concrete, say you want to apply for say an October 2027 start. I would say at least a year before that would be a good time to start. And if you're thinking of a PhD, which is a research-based master's, even earlier, I would say maybe the summer. So the things that might be involved are, first of all, of course, finding a good course that suits your interests. And if it's a research-based course where it involves a dissertation or a thesis, you need to find a supervisor, or at least identify potential supervisors. So you want to have a look around the faculties and departments and whether their work is a good fit for you. And even within your interest, there may be 2 or 3 courses, master's courses, say, that fit your interest. So you might want to consider which one is a better fit, or whether you want to apply to multiple ones. And even at the practical level, you do want to start thinking about things like getting references, because that's an important part of the application. So you want to give enough time, heads up to your referees, so that they have time to write the letter, and collecting your transcripts. But also for research-based courses, you want to leave yourself enough time to formulate a good research proposal.
Nice. And because I imagine there's various deadlines, and especially for funding and various steps for the application process, it would be a shame. I guess applicants want to avoid missing like a funding deadline if they leave the application too late.
Yeah, so being aware of the deadlines is critical. Funding deadlines are typically in early December, and this is especially important for overseas students. So you want to get in your application well before then, and this includes getting your references in and everything. So the postgraduate website, the postgraduate admissions office, has a great website with all sorts of information. So yeah, do stay on top of the deadlines.
Nice. Yeah, and we'll put a link to the postgraduate admissions website in the caption so that you can have a look at that. So for anyone who doesn't know, can you briefly go through what the application process is like? I assume they're different for a PhD and a master's degree. So maybe from the master's side, what does the process look like?
Sure. So even in masters, there's 2 kinds of masters here at Cambridge, what's called a taught masters and a research masters. A taught masters has a substantial, a taught component where you do coursework and take modules. But it could also have a thesis component, but it could still be a taught masters if there's substantially, a lot of lectures and other coursework that you have to do. So for a taught masters, usually I would say go on the course website. There's lots of information on the on the structure of the course and the modules they offer, and if there's a dissertation component, how it's organized. So leave yourself enough time to familiarize yourself with the course. And then the application typically would involve transcripts, references, and maybe a short statement of your interests and career goals. For a research master's and for a PhD, the research proposal is an additional component that can be quite important.
Nice. And if students are thinking of applying for either of those masters, should they reach out to the department beforehand, or is that not necessary?
Yeah, it can be a good idea. So for a taught master's, I would say it's strictly not necessary if you're sort of content with the information on the website and have all your questions answered. But there's usually an email specified on the website for pre-application inquiries, and you should feel free to email them if you have any questions about the course offerings or modules, or what sort of dissertation options they may have. For research masters, I think it can be quite useful. So rather than the specific department, it may be worth reaching out to specific supervisors who you think might be a good fit for you, or who might be well qualified to supervise your work. And there, what I would say is try to tailor your email expressing your interest and why you're interested in their work and why they may be a good fit for you, rather than sending a generic email. But I would also add that academics tend to be quite busy and sometimes a little overwhelmed during term. So if you don't get a reply, it's not necessarily a bad sign, but I think it is worth reaching out to people you're interested in.
Nice. And would it be worth following up on an email if you haven't heard back?
Yeah, I would think so, because it just might be that they were busy and it fell through the cracks. I personally try to reply to emails that are sort of express an interest in my work and that are not clearly just form emails. But, and most academics would, I think.
Yeah, nice. So if anyone who doesn't know, what's the difference between the research masters and something like a doctorate or a PhD course? Because at least some people might assume that research orientated study is something you do for PhD.
Yes, and they're quite similar. I think the main difference would be just in the scope, because here in Cambridge, most research masters tend to be 1-year MPhil courses between 9 months and 12 months. So you're expected to do research and write a dissertation in that period of time. So I think both the length and the scope of the work is going to be somewhat shorter than what's expected of a PhD, which is between 3 and 4 years. So I would say it's good preparation for a PhD in certain fields, and in many fields it's not required. You could transition from a taught master's to a PhD, but if you're interested in a shorter term research project and you're not sure whether a PhD is the right fit for you, this can be a good sort of starting point.
Nice. So a student won't have. It's a way for them to not commit to 3-4 years, but do it for 1 year, for example.
Yeah, or if they feel like their undergrad experience or their master's experience previously has been primarily taught and they want to get an experience of research, that could be a good way to do it. But that said, not all departments or faculties offer a research master's programs. And again, you have to find a supervisor. But if you can, that would be, a useful experience. Yeah.
Nice. And could you also briefly explain, well, before we get into the DPhil PhD application process, could you explain what the difference is between a DPhil and a PhD and what Cambridge offer?
The short answer is there's not really a difference. I think they're all equivalent doctoral programs, and I think it's just different places use different abbreviations. Okay. I think Oxford uses DPhil, but at Cambridge we tend to use PhD, which is, I think, what's used in most of the rest of the world as well.
Yeah. Okay. And what does the application process look like for the PhD application process?
Yeah, so it's similar to the master's in that you need transcripts and you need references, but a research proposal can also be an important component of the PhD, and especially for the arts and humanities, it's maybe 3 or 4 page sort of document that you write outlining what you'd like to work on for your PhD. And I'm personally in engineering, but from what I gather in arts and humanities, I think this can be quite an important part of the evaluation process. That said, in the sciences as well, the research proposal is quite important. Unlike the arts, it may not be exactly what you end up working on, because your exact research direction is often shaped, within by the research group and your collaboration within that. But it is useful to highlight that you can coherently think about a research topic and identify certain interesting research directions. So I would say take it seriously, regardless of which field you're applying in. So that's I would say the main difference between a master's application and a PhD. And of course, for a PhD, if you have relevant research experience, that can count as a plus. It's not essential, but anything aligned to what you would like to work on is often useful.
So, talk when you were mentioning about what the day-to-day might look like for a PhD student in the sciences, and the research group. For engineering example, what place do PhD students hold, and what other members are there in a typical research group?
Yeah, so in the sciences especially, the PhD students are an integral part of what makes Cambridge a top research university. So typically there's a supervisor, and some groups are large. They may have 8 PhD students and a bunch of postdoctoral researchers. And typically there will be meetings with the supervisor, ideally once a week, and then additional probably meetings with other members of the group. You may have a group meeting, or sometimes students may have other secondary mentors within the department, or it may be a postdoc or more senior researcher within the same group. So often in these big groups, there tends to be a direction, a broad set of research questions that the PI or the principal investigator is interested in, and the student will sort of identify some directions, in conversation with other members of the group, and then they'll own that project. So that's how it works. But that's not, always the case. Some research groups may be smaller. I, for instance, rarely have more than 3 or 4 PhD students. So I individually meet with them, and sometimes they have overlapping projects and sometimes they have their own projects. So the main difference, I would say, between the arts and sciences is the supervisors and the research groups tends to be work closely with the PhD student, and papers also tend to be co-authored.
In the sciences?
In the sciences. Whereas in the arts, from what I understand, it's mostly individual research, and the student sort of owns the scholarship. And the role of the supervisor is to give feedback and, help set directions, higher level feedback, I would say, and also feedback on the writing.
Nice. So would I be right in thinking that in the kind of science research group, it would be really tough for any of the projects to happen without the PhD students?
I think PhD students are integral. I mean, that said, you could, in principle, have a research group with primarily postdoctoral researchers, but I think that's almost never happens. PhD students are essential to drive research forward. And it's viewed as just training the next generation of researchers and scientists. Yeah.
Nice. That's really cool. So would I also be right in thinking that it sounds like for the PhD application process, and we've touched on this briefly, but it's a really good idea if a student has a supervisor in mind that they would like to do their PhD for, to get in touch and maybe have a Zoom call or meetup before. Yeah,
that would be ideal. So I would encourage applicants to reach out to potential supervisors.
Yeah.
But that said, there are different sorts of PhD programs all over the country, but also in Cambridge, there are what's called centers of doctoral training, which take in cohorts of PhD students, say in subjects like, say, biology or physics or what have you. And then the first year will have a little bit of taught coursework, but they'll also do what's known as rotations. They'll sort of do little projects, 3 or 4 month projects in different labs, so that then they can pick one they like. And the supervisor is a good fit, and so on. So in that case, it would be just like applying to a sort of a master's program, and you can just apply to the CDT, and there might be interviews and things like that. But regardless, I think it's if there's someone whose work really resonates with you and you think you'd like to work with them, I would encourage people to sort of write to them, because there's no harm even if you don't get a reply. The process of sort of researching, and thinking about what you want to do and formulating, a good email can be useful, I think.
Yeah. So with the CDT, is that like a year-long program that students do before they do their PhD?
Yeah, it tends to be a 1+3 program. The first year is often called the MRes, Master of Research. So they have a little bit of coursework, and then they do research projects as well. And then the idea is the first year then leads on to a PhD. By the end of the first year, they identify a supervisor usually there's a network of supervisors associated with the CDT, not necessarily in one department, but could be across departments or even across universities. And then you sort of work with them for the next 3 years.
So when you're applying for that, are you applying for is that under the umbrella of PhDs or under the umbrella of masters?
Yeah, I think it's a sort of a combined program, and there are CDTs. The application requirements for those will be clearly sort of flagged in the website. So I would say go to the websites and read up on the information, but it's primarily a PhD program with a first year master's. I would say
Wow, that sounds really cool. It's really useful also for applicants to.
But I should say that not all fields have the CDT available. So they are there in certain fields, and these change depending on the Research Council funding and so on.
Yeah, nice. And one thing applicants might want to know is, are there interviews in the application process for either the master's programs or the PhD programs?
Yeah, I think lots of departments have interviews, especially for PhDs. That's quite usual. So after we receive your application in a department, you may be contacted for interviews if it's a research master's or a PhD. And not everyone is contacted for interviews, but if you're being considered for PhD, you may be contacted, and these may be by one or a small group of academics. And the style of the interview can sort of really depend on the field. So in engineering, for instance, we ask them to often give us a short presentation, maybe 10, 15 minutes on any topic sort of they've worked on. And then maybe we'll ask them some follow-up technical questions just to gauge their background and interest in the course.
So I assume it differs between each subject, but are these interviews more academic interviews, or are they more like a job interview where they'll want to understand the motivations of the applicant?
Yeah, I would say it's primarily academic, but there may be questions like what long-term, what would you like to do, and so on. That's more out of just curiosity, just to get a holistic picture of the applicant. But I would say they're primarily judged on the academics, and the interview may involve sort of discussing your research proposal that you've included in the application.
So the next question that we have here is, some applicants might be worried or think that networking is a large part of the application process, or a large part of linked to how successful or likely they'll be to get an application. Is networking an important part of the application process, would you say?
Well, I don't think so. At least traditionally what we think of as networking. What I would say is having some relevant experience that's relevant to the course you're applying for can be really useful. So, for instance, if you've done, say, a research internship or a project in an area related to the course you're applying for, that can be useful, and it's probably going to be reflected in your references as well. So your referees, I guess, would be people who you've worked with either for an internship or research project, or who you might have taken a module or a course with them and done well in that course. So you do need 2 or 3 people to write references for you typically from your home institution or from your previous institution. So in that sense, I guess, in that very loose sense, networking is important. But it's certainly not the case that you need to know people in the department you're applying to, or know somebody at Cambridge, because the vast majority of people who come here for postgraduate studies, often don't have prior experience of Cambridge.
Nice. I think that's really encouraging for a lot of people to hear. Another thing that I saw when I was researching for the podcast was that it says online that once a course is full, then they won't accept any more applications. And that's very different to the undergrad application process. So can you explain what that means logistically?
Yeah, so typically we have, so this is more relevant to master's programs, I think. So master's programs almost always have a clear application deadline that's advertised on the course website. So you should apply well before the deadline. And then they'll consider all applications that come in before the deadline, and they'll make their offers. So the course is full might refer to the college part of the process. So what happens is once the department reviews the application and decides to make an offer, it goes to the postgraduate admissions office, and then they make you a conditional offer, and then it gets forwarded on to a college. And if you get to choose 2 colleges as your top 2 preferences, then it'll go to the first preference college, and if they don't have space, to the second. So this don't have space is probably what it refers to when the course is full, because each college has a certain capacity for the number of postgrads, and they want to maintain a certain number of places for each course. And so say you're applying for history and they have, say, 5 MPhil places in the arts and humanities, and they're filled, you might get forwarded on to another college. But the important thing to note is you will get accepted by one college or another if you're accepted by the department.
Nice. And another thing that we want to talk about is funding, which I think is a large part of both the master's course and the PhD courses. How should a student go about getting funding and financial support? And is this something that they reach out to the university or the college or an organisation independent to either of those two institutions?
Yeah. So funding can be really crucial for lots of postgraduate applicants. In fact, for most, I would say. So the first thing to remember is the postgraduate admissions office has a really good sort of website on summarizing all the sources of funding. So I would encourage people to start there. They have a nice introductory video. It's only about 3 minutes. So I would encourage all applicants to watch it first. And there's a bewildering array of funds in Cambridge, funding sources for postgraduate studies. But the good news is most of them are all through the common application process. So your application will be through the applicant portal. And when you go there, the important thing is to tick the box that says, I want to be considered for funding. So once you do that, the system itself will sort of flag up or present to you options of funding that you are eligible for. And so some of them may require a short statement of interest. So for instance, the Cambridge Trust and the Gates. So as it comes up, just make sure you tick the relevant boxes and fill out the statements that need to be filled in. And then depending on your course, there may be specific pots of funding available. Again, the system will tell you about it. So most of it is through the application. But if you want to know the sources of funding that are available for your course, you can go to the funding search. The postgraduate office website also has a student funding search. You can go there and have a look. But the main thing I would say is pay attention during our application process and just tick the right boxes. The final thing I would say is you may also want to look at external sources of funding, just as an additional thing you can apply for. And those also, a lot of them are listed on the postgraduate admissions website. So if you just search for postgraduate study external funding, there's a whole list of them, and see if you are interested or eligible to apply for any of them. And the final thing I would add is when you're considering college preferences, it may also help to have a look at the colleges you're interested in and whether they have anything on postgraduate funding, because a lot of colleges do postgraduate funding and they do it in conjunction with the university or other funding bodies within the university. But some of them may have sort of separate pots of funding, which you may have to apply for separately, but most of them don't, I think. We don't at this college. So the short answer is start at the postgraduate admissions office website, look at the video, and then just tick the relevant boxes.
Nice. Am I right in thinking a lot of these funding opportunities will have deadlines themselves. So it's to say, like, if you're making an application, there's an application deadline, but there's some fundings have a funding deadline. So am I right in thinking you should send in the application before whichever deadline is earlier?
Yeah, yes, that's certainly the case. And the funding deadline is typically early December.
Okay.
For most departments. Some departments have early January, but if you get in your application by early December, I think you'll be in good shape. And the earlier you send it, the more likely it's to come earlier to the college that you've applied for, and that gives you a better chance of being considered for funding there as well.
Nice. And lastly, to go more in, so I mean, most universities aren't collegial, and Cambridge is quite unique in that it is a collegial university. Can you briefly explain what are the colleges and where and how, like, and what does postgraduate life look like in a collegial university?
Sure. So at the postgraduate level, the college, I would say, plays more of a social role.
Yeah.
So most colleges, or all colleges, have accommodation, and often postgraduate students live in college accommodation, at least for the first year, but often in subsequent years as well. And so that's where they often also socialize. They have a circle of friends. And it can be quite nice because at the faculty or department, if you're, say, a scientist, you probably interact with people, all working in the same field. But in college, you get to sort of interact with a huge array of people from all sorts of fields. And I mean, of course, Cambridge has formal dinners, and you can be part of societies, sports societies, rowing, music, and there's all the options that undergraduates have, postgraduates have as well.
Nice. And what can you explain a bit about what kind of postgraduate accommodation there is at Trinity Hall?
Yes. So our postgraduate accommodation is in Whitfield, which is a site in West Cambridge. It's about a mile from the center of town.
Yeah.
And it's quite conveniently located. It's about a 10-minute cycle ride to center of town.
Yeah.
And it's also convenient for the departments that are now located in West Cambridge, like a lot of the science departments are. So it's really lovely. The gardens are beautiful. I think they're among the loveliest in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And there's gym facilities, and there's a bit of older accommodation as well as newer accommodation. So there's a range of price points depending on what you're looking for.
Nice. Yeah, if anyone who wants to have a look around, whether it's the central site or Whitfield, but can't come into Cambridge, we have a virtual tour of the college and the off-site accommodation on our website, and we can put a link to that in the YouTube caption if you want to have a look at the postgraduate accommodation here. And lastly, at the very start, you were saying that you're a postgraduate tutor, and I believe every college has a postgraduate tutor. Can you explain what that role involves?
Sure. So every postgraduate student is assigned a postgraduate tutor. So I'm one of 3 here at Trinity Hall. And we are just an extra layer of support because postgraduate students are primarily, their work is based in the faculty or department, or if you're in the arts and humanities, you might go to the library or the archives doing research. But we are just an additional layer of support. We are not necessarily someone in your field or even someone close to your field. But if you're having some problems with your time in Cambridge, with your work, say, for instance, you're having problems getting along with your supervisor or someone else in your research group, or, for instance, you might, for some unforeseen reason, you have financial difficulties. So we can sort of help you, help direct you towards resources to help with that. So, for instance, the college has an excellent wellbeing team. We often direct students there. And we have sources of hardship funding both in college and at the university level. And there may even be rather low-level things, like if you apply for, say, funding to pursue a sport or some other activity, the college has sources of funds, and often the tutor is involved in writing a short statement of support. So basically, we are just another layer of support outside your faculty or department.
So from the student's perspective, they have their postgraduate tutor, their supervisor as well, and then each college has a wellbeing team. There's the university wellbeing team and facilities as well. It sounds like there's a lot of different support networks.
Yeah, there certainly is. The idea is if things are not, for some reason, you're not able to speak to someone within your department, or the problems you're facing are more sort of social or personal, we can sort of help with that.
Nice. That's really cool. I think it's a really important thing for applicants to know, because I think it's quite unique to Cambridge, the tutorial role. Well, thank you, Ramji. That's all the questions we have today. Really interesting podcast on the postgraduate application process, and something that's really different to the undergraduate application process. And thanks to the viewers for watching. We're hoping to do more podcasts on the postgraduate application process and what postgraduate life is like at Cambridge and at Trinity Hall, getting more students on the podcast to talk about how they found their studies here. So we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, how was that?
Yeah, I think it was okay. Yeah.
It was really good.
Good.